This is a video about Act 1, Scene 2 of Macbeth, looking at it in detail. It's a key scene, the first real key scene of the play that is likely to be used by AQA, the exam board. Now, it's basically all about Macbeth, but we don't see Macbeth. It's one of Shakespeare's common techniques, particularly in his tragedies, to take the central figure and introduce him to us by reputation, by listening to other people talk about them first of all, then quite often bring on somebody who is completely different to our expectations. Now in this scene, which starts with Malcolm, and it is important it's Malcolm, introducing an injured captain who's commanded by Duncan to tell him about the situation in the war between Scotland and Norway. That captain then tells him about how a rebel called MacDonald, so clearly a Scottish rebel, was leading an assault on the king's troops until Macbeth killed him on the battlefield. But he says he doesn't know the final outcome of the battle. The Thane of Ross then arrives once the captain's been taken off to doctors or surgeons. He arrives with the news that the Thane of Cawdor has turned traitor on the battlefield, but Macbeth and Banquo's bravery has won the war. And finally, Duncan pronounces that the Thane of Cawdor is to be executed as a traitor and his title awarded to Macbeth for his bravery. So we see it's all very much based around the idea of Macbeth as a brave character. Macbeth as also essentially pretty much the ultimate soldier as well, who seems to be performing almost superhuman acts on the field. Now, if we take these to be the seven of the big issues that are at the heart of the play, this scene is particularly concerned with these four, I would say. Macbeth, obviously, as we've already said, this is our first real proper introduction to him. Ambition and loyalty, because we hear a great deal about treachery as well at the same time here. Gender, because it's a great deal about masculinity. And kingship, because we see Duncan's behaviour as a king and what a kind of a king he is. So we're going to take this through three key moments, and the first one comes right at the opening. It's basically the sergeant's speech. Well, it says sergeant. It's referred to as a captain, and then it says sergeant at the top. So it's interchangeable which one he is. Generally seems to be referred to as the captain. Now, in this speech of his, in which he delivers to Duncan exactly the situation and exactly what Macbeth's done, we start with this simile at the beginning. And it's a typical Shakespeare simile in terms of the fact it's very visual, very expressive, a comparison to something that's completely irrelevant really to what's going on, but it gives us a real sense. The idea of two spent swimmers, two exhausted swimmers who've given their all. And as they are exhausted in the middle of the ocean, what they do is cling onto each other, and of course then they can't swim anymore. So when we unpack that, I suppose you've got to think about the idea, first of all, the sense that these two armies are basically at a stalemate, or were at a stalemate. But at the same time, you've got the sense that they were bringing each other down, choking their arts. It's interesting to use the phrase art as well, as though that's something you can apply to war. I'd also encourage you to think carefully about the idea of using swimmers in this. Two competitive swimmers swimming to outdo each other, to go fastest. And consider why that is something that Shakespeare has chosen in this place. Now further down that speech, what we then get, having seen that simile, is we get, again, also a typically Shakespeare example of personification. Personifying fortune. almost fate in this case, really, um, and destiny. Now, the idea, of course, is that fortune was on MacDonald's side. Okay, that fate seemed to be on his side at this point, and that Macbeth actually overcame those odds. So it shows Macbeth as somebody who is able to overcome almost supernatural forces in some ways. The idea of destiny not being able to hold him in, which is quite interesting, bearing in mind what's going to happen to Macbeth. Okay. But in this personification, first of all, fortune is described as smiling on MacDonald the rebel, smiling on his quarrel, on his argument, his aggression, yeah, smiling down on him, and acting like he is his whore, obviously his personal servant, his personal slave, doing whatever he wishes. But obviously there's a deeper issue, an idea to that, when you think of a whore as being, in this case, I think more of a mistress than a prostitute. Somebody similar to Bianca in Othello, if anybody knows that play, who's a kept woman. So it's the idea that fortune is basically being the mistress of MacDonald, and obviously there's implications in there. Now think about that idea, and then think about the idea that Macbeth just disdains fortune. He doesn't just ignore it, he shows disdain for it. Okay? Like it is not of any importance. Now this feeds into the succession of epithets that we have here. And epithets, again, something very Shakespearean he likes to use. In the first case here, we just have the word brave attached to Macbeth. And we do get that a lot at the beginning. Brave Macbeth, noble Macbeth. Obviously, we don't get it later in the play, so it's a very clear difference from later on. But at this point, it's used to attach that idea. Macbeth, what is he? He is brave Macbeth. Then we get the comparison to him being Valor's minion. Valor being, I suppose, best defined as a kind of bravery, particularly associated with the battlefield, with physical acts. And he is essentially the minion, the servant of Valor. He is working for bravery itself, it appears, in what he does. And then we get Duncan's address, in which he refers to him as a valiant cousin. They're valiant, again, the descriptor, the adjective from Valor. So he is using the same idea, worthy gentleman. He's also noting the connection between the two of them. But that address, Valor, valiant, worthy, brave, not what we would see. And actually, it's difficult to say what an audience of 1606 would feel. But I do get the impression that it's quite likely that his audience, Shakespeare's audience, would also have felt revolted by this idea. The idea that on the battlefield, Macbeth doesn't just kill MacDonald as we would imagine him to, but he tortures him. He's there in front of him, he's carved out his passage to get there, and he disembowels him. He rips him open, so that essentially he will suffer as much as he possibly can. Apologies for anyone who's a bit disturbed by this, but if you unseen someone from the nave to the chaps, basically their organs are going to come out, and the person is going to be alive for a brief time at least while that happens. And then the idea of taking off his head and fixed on the battlements is an obvious foreshadowing, of course, of the end of the play, and deliberately therefore places MacDonald in the situation that we have at the end, and maybe even shows the difference between Macduff and Macbeth, that Macduff does not resort to this. He does not resort to torture. So overall, I think what we're seeing here is we're seeing a presentation of a situation which seemed at first stalemate and then became almost hopeless, looking like destiny was on the side of the opposites. And then Macbeth portrayed as somebody who can overcome destiny, as somebody who essentially is so brave it's as though they're working for valour. And we get the praise of Duncan and the praise of the captain for his behaviour, while we look at some examples and carved out his passage and smoke with bloody his steel smoking with bloody execution go in as well, and add to this. While we look at and hear language that is repulsive, it suggests that Macbeth is brutal at best, bloodthirsty at worst. So when looking at this scene, I think this is what you want to be asking yourself. You first of all want to get the idea of the picture of Macbeth we're given, both through the captain and Duncan, but also through our response, which I feel would quite probably be very different. And secondly, it's worth asking yourself about Duncan. He only has a few words, but look at his reaction to what's going on. Look at the way he speaks about Macbeth and consider what kind of king he is, therefore, praising what Macbeth has just done there, but also what he sees as therefore making him worthy. Now that's a very important key moment, but there are further examples here. Certainly when the captain continues speaking after this, with a warning essentially that things got worse again, and more ideas about Macbeth and Banquo and what they're. It starts again with this idea of valour, this word that comes throughout the play and is so important. And he attaches the idea of now justice arming itself with valour. What we've just seen, what Macbeth did and what their side did was just. Justice is on their side. And valour was their armour. Valour was their weapon that they managed to do. But we're told that after that situation, the Norwegian lords, remember they're fighting Norway, started a fresh assault. Now Duncan wants to know, as he says there, did this not dismay our captains Macbeth and Banquo, I suppose, having already apparently won it once, to have another attack on them? And the captain responds semi-sarcastically, really, when he says, yes, it dismayed them. Of course, he does. No, it didn't. It sounds like he's agreeing to that, and then, of course, he throws in the line, as sparrows, eagles, or the hare, the lion. Yeah, it bothered them as much as sparrows bother eagles, or a hare bothers the lion. Now, it's quite interesting to see how that imagery worked, because obviously quite clearly Macbeth and Banquo are being characterised as eagles or a lion. And that gives you a sense of the majesty and grandeur of them to begin with. There's another example of a bigger version of something attacking a small one, okay, which comes back in imagery later on. And again, birds, very important throughout this, as well as this image of the lion. And in taking it further, we get these two quite complex images that are well worth remembering, whether this comes up as a key moment or whether it actually is a piece of evidence that you end up using elsewhere. First of all, the imagery is that they were like similes used as they were like cannons overcharged with double cracks. Cannons that you put twice the amount of gunpowder into. Okay? Overcharged. Now again, consider first of all the intention in the captain saying that, the intention we're meant to take, but also the reaction we have. You know, it makes them seem like weapons, again, beyond the norm, double charged cannons. That's what they were. And again, it may well be the double cracks could well be referred to the fact there's two of them. I think it's probably more likely just the idea that they are so powerful, so aggressive that they managed to do this. But at the same time, we might look at it and see that phrase overcharged as almost a critique, as almost a sense of them losing a sense of control. And that's definitely followed up with this strange image that is so rarely used. I'm not sure I've ever seen anybody use this, any student use this to this point. He talks about the idea, except they're meant to bathe in reeking wounds or memorise another Golgotha, I cannot tell. It's a back to front sentence. It's easier understood if you start with, I can't tell whether, why they did this or how they did it for any reason except that possibly they meant to bathe in the reeking wounds or memorise another Golgotha. Now, bathing in reeking wounds speak for itself. This image of them wanting to bath in the wounds of other people and the reeking wounds, the stinking wounds of other people is horrific. But then memorising the other Golgotha. Now, Golgotha is the hill on which it was said Jesus was crucified. Now, that doesn't necessarily come out well for them, because what happened at Golgotha? Is it referring to the idea of the crucifixion of a good person? Is that what they're trying to achieve? Are they being the Romans here? Or are we looking at the idea of resurrection? Yeah, Golgotha, he got crucified, supposedly Jesus, and then he was resurrected a few days later. That they're coming back, is that what it is? Whichever it is, I think those three things there are things you can look at closely and consider. Are they giving us a different impression to what the captain is suggesting? Still get Duncan speaking at the end of this. So well thy words become thee as thy wounds, they smack of honour both. And I think this is an interesting one to consider, Duncan as a king here, because when you think this, it's very throwaway to many of us here. Well done, off you go. That kind of idea, a little compliment there. But look who he's complimenting. He's complimenting a captain who doesn't have a name. Doesn't have a name because he's not that important. Characters in Shakespeare that don't have names and just are known by their job, role, whatever, are only there as a function. They don't have any kind of character to them. So he's not significant. He's just a member of the army. But Duncan is careful to praise him, to talk about his words as well as his wounds. So as much as what he's gained in the battle, fighting bravely, he's talking about the way he speaks and the words he brings. They fit you both because they smack of honour, and you are clearly an honourable person. Now, he doesn't need to compliment this here, and this has got direct parallels in Act 5 when Macbeth is confronted by servants and messengers and people like that who he insults and dismisses and threatens. Duncan seems to have a touch with the common man that Macbeth doesn't have. And this probably is why Macbeth later on will describe him as being loved by the people so much. So this is a further picture of Macbeth. Consider it's not different from before, but how this is taken a bit further forward. And the same with Duncan here. By the end of this bit, how are we feeling about the two of them now? Okay, so the last key moment I'm going to go for here is a slightly edited version of when Ross arrived, the Thane of Ross. Obviously a much higher level messenger. He wasn't necessarily in the battle himself. And Ross, remember, acts as a messenger throughout the play. And almost, you could argue, as kind of like the conscience to the play in some ways. Because, here he is bringing messages to Duncan. He'll take the message about being Thane of Cawdor to Macbeth just after this. He will be seen at Macbeth's side a number of times, including at the banquet that Banquo is meant to have come to, but doesn't, of course, because he's dead. But then after that moment, he turns and joins the other side. The next time we see him is taking a message from Macduff to Lady Macduff, and then taking the message to Macduff about the murder of his family as well. So it's as though that moment when the banquet goes so wrong is the turning point for someone who is as loyal as Ross. And we talked about ambition and loyalty here, and Ross is a very good example of that. Remember, in another scene, which begins with Ross talking to an old man about kind of strange happenings that have been going on around. The second half of that scene involves Macduff turning up and telling us that Macbeth's been named king and is gone off to be crowned. And when Ross says, "Oh, are you going off to see him?" Macduff says, "No, I'm not, I'm going home," showing Macduff's doubts. But Ross actively chooses there to say to Macduff, "No, well, I'm going to go to see him. I'm going to go to Macbeth and to his coronation." So that change to join Macduff's side later on is significant. It's a slight little side point here, but it's a good point to make at this point and to understand about Ross and his role. Message. He's far more judgmental in many ways than the captain is, as you'd expect from someone higher up. Introduces the Thane of Cawdor as a most disloyal traitor. Again, it shows Ross's loyalty, that he is so disgusted by that. But it's also very interesting that the successor as Thane of Cawdor is going to prove as much, or probably more, of a disloyal traitor. He uses his own epithet for Macbeth, Bellona's bridegroom, he calls him. Bellona being the Roman goddess of war. So it's a picture essentially of Macbeth being so, well, aggressive and violent from our point of view, so brave and soldierly from theirs, I suppose, that it's as though he essentially is marrying the goddess of war himself. It's a very interesting one to use. And also interesting that Ross never uses here Macbeth's name. He just uses that epithet for him. We'll understand. Then finally, of course, we get another Duncan bit in here. Now, Duncan, as we saw in Key Moment 2, can be a very man of the people, very gentle with people in certain ways. But we did see already his harshness when he was able, comfortable to praise Macbeth's torture of Macdonald on the battlefield. And here we see, again, a side to Duncan that suggests he is very decisive. His first reaction to being told about the Thane of Cawdor is have him executed. Go pronounce his present death. There's no detail, no depth, no debate about it, no speech about it. He decides that, and he decides immediately to give that title to Macbeth. And then finishes with a little very Shakespearean ending here. What he hath lost, no Macbeth hath won. Shakespeare loves these balancing phrases that use two parts to it. But in this particular case, we could see this as another connection with the supernatural, with the witches. In the scene that we've already seen, they discussed meeting when the battle's lost and won. And there's definitely similarities in this line here. Are we meant to see that Duncan's decision here is kind of influenced by the witches? Or are we just meant to, is it just something that's bringing us towards the idea that the witches are going to take more power than we think? Anyway, whatever it is, Duncan, much more interest here. This is definitely, I would say, Duncan's main scene. He's only in 3 scenes in the entire play. And I think we get more from this scene than anything else. So, the first impression of Macbeth that we've been having, how's it brought together with the Bellona's bridegroom and the hints to anything else there? And the same with Duncan. Following on from there, bring it together. By the end of this scene, how are we feeling about Duncan? It's very, very significant and important. Okay, so the big ideas. You can see here are questions you should be asking yourself about them. Simple with Macbeth's character, this is all about first impressions. What are they? And that should allow you to go deeper into thinking about why. How maybe do we react to this? Maybe we're seeing him already in a complex way. And ambition and loyalty, there are a number of examples of betrayal and loyalty in this scene. We see examples of two people who betray Duncan, essentially a rebel in MacDonald and a traitor in the Thane of Cawdor. Now that, first of all, establishes something about Duncan, the fact that there's two people who are turning against him. But then we get the signs of loyalty as well. And in this case, it's mostly Macbeth and Banquo, of course, alongside him, as well as Ross. So we have this kind of contrast between the two, but of course Macbeth is going to jump from one side to the other, and that will allow us to see how easily he does that, what motivates him to do it. Masculinity, that whole idea about the torture on the battlefield, the brutality of everything here, being seen as something to cheer and praise, tells us something about the picture of masculinity we're getting that carries on throughout the play, before we get to kingship, where this is probably the best example of Duncan as a king. So if we take it further around, you can see a few examples here. You've obviously got to take this first impression of Macbeth and think, how is that going to change, okay, over the rest of it? But also, how is this a direct contrast with Macbeth, who we're going to meet in the following scene? And are there things in here which are deliberately preparing us for aspects of Macbeth that are going to come out gradually? With ambition and loyalty, okay, we see Macbeth's loyalties change over the play, and we see Ross's loyalties change in certain ways as well, and we see more betrayals. But the interesting thing here is structural. What is Shakespeare doing to set up the idea of betrayal and loyalty in the play? And that's, I think, the point. He's deliberately addressing that idea. Why? And then masculinity, to see if this carries on the same way throughout the play. And kingship, a direct comparison of Duncan with Macbeth, and further with Malcolm as well, and potentially with Banquo, who doesn't become king, but definitely shows kingly qualities, as Macbeth himself says. Okay, so Act 1, Scene 2, in depth. I hope you see a lot there that you could use if this comes up.